Because this is a 3D print, it still has some residue on it from the printer that I'll need to clean off. To do this, I'm going to soak it in some methylated spirit. After about 5 to 10 minutes has passed, I can take it out and start scrubbing it with an old toothbrush, some washing up liquid, and rinse under hot water. Once the model has dried off, we can then start our prep. I'm using some hobby clippers to cut off the remaining supports from the printer. Once that's done, I'm filing down all the bobbles left over from supports or printing failures. I'm particularly focusing on smoothing the rim of the base, as it's incredibly uneven at the moment. If the prep leaves any weird scratchy marks, I can use a mold line remover to smooth it down. This process does create a lot of dust, which can make things harder to see, so I use a large brush to flick away all of the dust occasionally. I'm mixing some green stuff, also known as Kneadertite, so I can fill in some gaps. To avoid it sticking to things, I recommend using some Vaseline on your fingers. You only need a tiny amount, and I like using silicone tools to move the putty into the right shape and smooth it out. Once that's done, I'm using some paper clips as pins and drilling into the base where I want to insert them. I'm using some super glue to make sure the pins stay in place. Once they're securely in place, I'm using my hobby clippers to trim them down and then insert them into a cork so I have something to hold when I'm painting. Next, I'm using some Vallejo surface primer to prime the model. If you don't have an airbrush, this particular primer can be used with a normal brush, or I recommend some Autotech grey plastic primer as an alternative. I'm also using some matte black to do a zenithal highlight. I took some pictures shining a lamp where I want the light to fall, and I'm using them as a reference on where to place the white. I'm using some white ink to create highlights, making sure to keep referring to those photos. As I want this piece to look really good, I want to make sure I have a solid plan prior to painting, as it will give me something to use as a proper reference. Using one of the photos I took earlier, I selected each part separately on Procreate and used the colour tool to change the colour of each section to create a fully coloured concept. I like doing concepts this way, because once you have each area separated, you can duplicate the canvas and come up with a few different ideas before you decide on a final one. On my concept, I made the shadows a bit more blue and the highlights a bit more yellow, so I'm going to be doing some underpainting. For the blue shadows, I'm using Calidor Sky from Citadel. And for the yellow highlights, I'm using Demonic Yellow from Army Painter. Once that's done, I'm going over the shadows to make them more apparent in a very thinned down Warflesh by Citadel. Locating shadows can be tricky if you don't have an eye for it, but what we're essentially trying to do is to see the world as a bunch of shapes. To help with this, you can take a picture of the model and put it in black and white. You can then go over the picture with a marker and outline where all of the areas of grey are. This will allow you to identify what shape each area makes and where it goes, to help you place it appropriately on the model. This will take a bit of practice, and I'd recommend you give it a go on lots of things around you, not just for miniature painting. I'm using some Orc Bust green to help blend some of those markings, but this will take quite a bit of back and forth. Next, I'm going over the areas where the light will be hitting it most with Ogrin Camo. I'm trying my best here to make it as smooth as I can, but to speed things up, I'm using a very thinned down Orc Bust green with my airbrush to help everything blend together better. For her top, I want it to make it look like hide, so I'm going to need to create a sense of texture. To start, I'm using chocolate brown for the base coat. To add some shadow, I'm using dark rust. I'm being extra careful around the edges so I don't accidentally mess up the skin. And I'm using dabbing motions to make a textured gradient. To lighten up the centre and top, I'm going back in with chocolate brown. And on the upper areas, I'm using some Gawthor brown. I'm using all three back and forth in a stippling motion to smooth out the gradient and add texture. To deepen the shadows, I'm also using a little bit of German black brown, and then blending that out with the previous colours. Once I have a smooth gradient, I'm using dark rust to go into the creases of the fabric to increase my contrast and add some definition. And to add some detail to the texture, I'm using some Gawthor brown to add some very faint scratches. For the fur trim, I'm base coating it in chocolate brown and using Carrick stone to make some lines, going downwards towards the tips similar to a highlight. I'm then going back in with Wraithbone to add some fainter lines. For the rope, I'm also going to base coat this in chocolate brown. And I'm going to add diagonal lines with Carrick stone, making sure to leave the recesses dark. To smooth things out, I'm going all over it with Agrax Earthshade. And then I'm using some Carrick stone to add some finer lines back in, and touching up with chocolate brown if we mess up. To paint the hair, I'm first base coating the hair in German grey. And then I'm using a black oil wash to run into all of the recesses. To base coat the leather armour, I'm using corn red. Going back to the hair, I'm highlighting with German grey. I want to darken down the red leather and fill in the pattern, so I'm using some Nuln Oil all over. Once dark, I can then start building on top by mixing corn red and some black, and then stippling that along the bottom areas where there will be some shadows. I can then work a gradient in and stipple corn red on its own towards the middle, and then use Wazdaka red in the lighter areas. For the leather strap, I'm base coating it with dark rust. And then, just as we did with the top and the red leather, we're stippling in some Mournfang brown all around the edges where the light is most likely to hit. I'm also using Mournfang brown to base coat the smaller strap, and then using Scrag brown for the highlight. Surprisingly enough, this is my first time doing non-metallic metal, so I wanted to start off with this small piece as a test. I started off with a base coat of German grey, and used London grey to add some highlights onto the sharper, raised areas. I tried to mix them together and work into it a little to smooth things out. Once satisfied, I used some light grey on top, and did a thin edge highlight on the sharp areas. For the bone areas, I base coated these with Wraithbone, being careful to stay in the lines. For the rest of the metal trim, I followed the routine I did earlier, base coating in German grey, with London grey for building up some highlights, but this time deliberately being a bit rough and splotchy with it. To increase the contrast levels, I used some black on the undersides, and then I used some light grey for the edge highlights, using both traditional lines as well as some smaller marks for texture. Moving on, I'm putting some Agrax Earthshade all over the bone to add some depth. And then I'm using some Carrick stone on the raised areas for a light highlight. I'm also doing some more on the hair with both black and German grey. For the eyes, I'm starting off with some pink horror all over, paying particular attention to the waterline, and then using a very thinned down layer of Kislev flesh along the waterline to make it a little less pink. For the whites of the eye, I'm starting off with light grey, and then stippling in some silver grey in the centre. To build up some colour, I'm carefully dotting some demonic yellow for the irises. Eyes tend to have a dark ring around the iris, so I'm using Castellan green around the edge. I'm then going back in with demonic yellow to neaten things up. Because the skin is green, I'm using a very thin down layer of War Boss green along the waterline. And to add a little more contrast, I'm going back in with some Ware flesh around the creases on the eyes and the nose. For the small leather straps, I'm using some Mournfang brown and then using Agrax Earthshade to darken the leather straps. I'm using a micron pen to do the pupils of the eye. For the eyebrows, I'm making small lines with German grey and then going over them with London grey. To smooth down the bone areas, I'm using some Karak stone with my airbrush and then going over it with some silver grey. And finally, with some Scrag brown, I'm dabbing this all over the metal areas to look like rust. For the base, I painted the part attached to the model black, and then drilled some holes into the plinth. I varnished the model with some gloss varnish to protect it whilst I worked on the plinth. Mixing some Kneadertite, I'm applying it around where the model and the plinth meet, and smoothing this down to try and make them look connected. Once set, I'm using some grey primer to help the paint stick to it as the surface is quite smooth and slippery. I'm then using some Darth Black to cover the whole base, and then using a matte varnish all over.